The tea had already gone cold by the time she noticed the woman watching her from across the dining room. That was unusual enough. In the quiet towns scattered along the old eastern railroads, people rarely stared unless they had reason to. Especially in places like the Ashburn Hotel, where wealthy travelers carried themselves with stiff manners and careful silence. A young woman sitting alone near the window was hardly worth anyone's attention. Yet the older woman in violet silk had not looked away once. She sat tall beneath the chandelier light, silver hair pinned with sapphires, gloves folded neatly in her lap. Everything about her spoke of old money and old rules, the kind that had survived wars, ruined families, and changing times. The staff moved nervously around her table as if one wrong word might cost them their jobs. The young woman lowered her teacup carefully. She had come to the hotel only to rest her feet and warm herself before catching the late coach west. Her dress was modest and slightly worn from travel, her gloves mended twice at the fingertips. No one in that grand dining room knew her name, and she preferred it that way. But the older woman suddenly rose from her chair. Every conversation nearby seemed to fade as she crossed the room. The young woman straightened in surprise when the stranger stopped directly beside her table. "You are alone," the older woman said quietly. It was not a question. The young woman nodded once, uncertain whether she was expected to stand. The woman studied her face with unsettling focus, as though comparing her to someone long dead. Then her expression softened just enough to reveal exhaustion beneath all that polished dignity. "I apologize for my boldness," she said. "But I believe you may be the answer to a very serious problem. That should have been the moment to leave." A sensible person would have thanked her politely, gathered her bag, and walked straight out into the snowy evening. But there was something strange in the woman's voice. Not arrogance, desperation. The older woman glanced toward the far end of the dining hall. A tall gentleman stood near the fireplace speaking with two businessmen. Even from across the room, there was no mistaking who he was. His dark coat was tailored to perfection, his posture sharp as a cavalry officer's, and every person around him seemed eager for his approval. The Duke of Blackthorn. His family's railroad empire stretched across 3 states. Newspapers followed his every move. Society mothers practically fought to place their daughters in his path. And yet the Duke himself looked miserable. "He refuses every young woman I introduce him to," the older woman muttered under her breath. "At this rate, the family name will die with him," the young woman blinked in confusion. "I don't understand what this has to do with me." The older woman pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without invitation. "My son requires an engagement immediately," she said. "A respectable one. Temporary, of course." The words landed so suddenly that the young woman nearly dropped her teacup. "I beg your pardon?" "You would only need to pretend for a short while," the woman continued calmly. "Attend dinners. Smile at the proper moments. Allow the newspapers to speak. Afterward, you would be generously compensated and free to continue your life." The young woman stared at her as if she had lost her mind. Outside, snow tapped softly against the tall windows. Somewhere in the hotel lobby, a piano played a slow ragtime tune. The entire world suddenly felt distant and unreal. "You cannot be serious. I assure you I have never been more serious in my life." The young woman looked again toward the Duke near the fireplace. At that exact moment he turned slightly and their eyes met across the crowded room. Coldness settled in her chest. There was no warmth in his expression, no curiosity either. Only suspicion. As though he already knew his mother was planning something reckless. And worse still, as though he intended to stop it. The Duke did not smile when his mother beckoned him over. If anything, his expression darkened with each step across the dining room floor. The young woman suddenly wished she had never entered the Ashburn Hotel at all. She had only wanted shelter from the bitter January wind and a hot cup of tea before continuing west toward Missouri. Instead, she now sat trapped between one of the richest women in the country and a man whose name appeared regularly in newspapers from Boston to Chicago. The Duke of Blackthorn stopped beside the table. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. Broad shoulders beneath a dark wool coat, sharp gray eyes, and the tired look of a man carrying responsibilities too heavy for one person. There was nothing soft about him. Not his face, not his voice, not even the way he held his gloves in one hand like he was preparing for an argument. "Mother," he said evenly, "what exactly are you doing?" The older woman lifted her chin. "Saving this family from humiliation. That usually means you are about to create more of it." The young woman lowered her eyes quickly, trying not to appear caught between them, but the Duke's attention shifted toward her almost immediately. His gaze lingered on the small travel bag near her chair, the scuffed leather shoes beneath her dress, the teacup trembling slightly in her hands. He noticed everything. "You frightened her," he said to his mother. "She will survive." The older woman folded her gloves carefully and turned toward the young woman again. "My son enjoys pretending he has endless time," she said. "Unfortunately, investors and rival families do not share his patience." The Duke exhaled sharply. "This discussion is inappropriate and necessary." Silence settled over the table. The young woman could feel nearby guests pretending not to listen while clearly hearing every word. Society people thrived on scandal the same way coal trains thrived on fire. Finally, she cleared her throat softly. "I believe there has been some misunderstanding," she said. "I am not the sort of woman suited for this arrangement," the Duke answered before his mother could. "No, you are not." His bluntness stung more than she expected, but then he surprised her. "You should leave before my mother talks you into something regrettable." The older woman's eyes narrowed. "There is nothing regrettable about helping people. Paying a stranger to pretend affection is not helping people. It is preserving stability." The young woman sat frozen as the argument continued around her. Only hours earlier, her biggest concern had been whether she had enough money left for another train ticket. Now she was somehow part of a disagreement involving dukes, railroads, and family reputation. She should leave. Yet something kept her seated. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe pride after the Duke dismissed her so quickly. Or maybe it was the strange sadness hidden beneath the older woman's polished appearance. The Duke rested one hand against the back of an empty chair. "You do realize the newspapers would destroy her the moment they learned the truth. They would never learn the truth if you behaved properly for once." His jaw tightened. That single reaction told her more than words could. This was not merely about marriage. Something else was happening beneath the surface of the Blackthorne family. Something important enough to make a powerful woman approach a complete stranger in desperation. The older woman suddenly softened her tone. "My dear," she said gently to the young woman, "perhaps you do not understand how serious matters have become." The Duke turned sharply. "Mother?" But she ignored him. "Certain business agreements depend upon my son appearing settled and dependable. There are men waiting for him to fail. Men who believe he is too distracted to lead the railroad after his father's death." The young woman listened carefully now. Everyone in America knew railroads controlled fortunes. Entire towns lived or died depending on where tracks were built. Powerful families guarded those empires fiercely. The Duke looked toward the window for a moment before speaking quietly. "You should not involve outsiders in family matters. And you should stop behaving like a man determined to ruin himself." The words hung heavily between them. For the first time, the young woman noticed exhaustion behind his cold expression. Not arrogance, weariness, as though he had spent months fighting battles no one else could see. A waiter approached nervously with fresh tea, clearly sensing tension at the table. The Duke waved him away before any cups could be replaced. Then he looked directly at the young woman again. "You said you were traveling west," he said. She nodded cautiously. "To Missouri. Family there?" "No. Then what waits for you?" The question caught her off guard. Nothing waited for her if she were honest. No wealthy relatives, no promised job. Only the hope of finding work somewhere far from the debts left behind after her father's death. But before she could answer, loud voices suddenly erupted near the hotel entrance. Several men in dark coats had entered the lobby. The moment the Duke saw them, every trace of calm vanished from his face. And when one of those men pointed directly toward their table, the young woman realized this strange family problem might be far more dangerous than anyone had admitted. The Duke stood so quickly his chair scraped hard against the polished floor. Every conversation in the dining room stopped. The men near the entrance removed their hats, but there was nothing respectful in the way they carried themselves. They looked like businessmen trying too hard to appear civilized. Heavy coats damp with melted snow, sharp eyes scanning the room, hands never far from their pockets. The tallest among them smiled faintly when he spotted the Duke. "There you are," he called across the lobby. "We were beginning to think you'd slipped away again." The Duke's expression turned cold enough to freeze the room. His mother rose slowly beside the table, every trace of softness gone from her face. "You were told not to approach my son in public," she said firmly. The man ignored her. Instead, his attention shifted toward the young woman seated beside them. That small glance made the Duke step slightly in front of her chair without seeming to think about it. Interesting. Very interesting. The man noticed it too. "Well now," he said with amusement. "Perhaps the rumors are true after all." "There are no rumors," the Duke replied. "Not yet." The tension pressing through the room felt almost physical. Even the hotel staff stood motionless, pretending to polish glasses or adjust curtains while secretly listening. The young woman gripped her teacup tighter. She still had no clear understanding of what was happening, only pieces scattered across hurried conversations. A railroad empire, investors losing confidence. Pressure for the Duke to marry, strangers arriving uninvited at night. And somehow she had stepped directly into the center of it. The older woman turned toward her quietly. "You should go upstairs," she said under her breath. "Immediately." But before the young woman could move, the tall man near the entrance spoke again. "Actually, I'd very much like to meet the lady." The Duke's jaw tightened. "That will not happen," the man chuckled softly. "That protective already?" "Your mother works faster than I expected." The young woman noticed several guests exchanging curious looks. Wealthy families survived on gossip, and one careless moment could travel across 3 states by morning train. The Duke seemed to realize the same thing. Without warning, he reached down and offered her his hand. For one stunned second, she simply stared at it. "If you wish to avoid becoming tomorrow's headline," he said quietly, "I suggest you trust me." The entire room was watching. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. A murmur spread through the dining hall almost instantly. The stranger near the entrance smiled wider. "Well," he said, "that answers several questions." The Duke ignored him completely. Instead, he guided her away from the table toward a quieter hallway lined with framed oil paintings and brass lamps. His pace was calm, but she could feel tension in the grip of his hand. Only when they rounded the corner out of sight did he finally release her. "I apologize," he said sharply. "That was necessary." "For what exactly?" "To keep them guessing." She folded her arms tightly. "I think someone owes me an explanation." For the first time since meeting him, the Duke looked uncertain, not weak. Just tired. He glanced back toward the dining room before lowering his voice. "The men downstairs represent a group trying to take control of Blackthorn Rail." The young woman blinked. "Can they do that?" "Not legally without certain approvals." His expression darkened. "But business in America no longer follows clean rules." A distant grandfather clock echoed through the hallway. The Duke continued carefully. "My father built the railroad honestly. After he died last spring, several investors decided I lacked the discipline to protect it. And marriage changes that?" "In their eyes, yes." She almost laughed at the absurdity. "So they think a wife makes you trustworthy?" "They think a family man is predictable." His honesty surprised her. The Duke leaned against the wall briefly, loosening the tension in his shoulders for the first time. "My mother believes a public engagement would calm investors long enough for me to secure the company." "And you disagree?" "I disagree with dragging innocent people into dangerous situations." Dangerous. The word lingered heavily. The young woman suddenly remembered the man pointing toward their table. The calculating smile. The way the Duke stepped in front of her without hesitation. This was bigger than newspaper gossip. "You think they would hurt someone?" The Duke did not answer immediately. That silence frightened her more than words. Finally, he looked directly at her. "What is your name?" She hesitated before answering softly. "Clara Bell." The name seemed to catch him off guard for reasons she could not understand. His expression shifted slightly, almost like recognition, before disappearing again. "Clara Bell," he repeated quietly. "You should leave this hotel tonight." "And go where?" "Anywhere far from Blackthorn business." A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. You speak as if people like me can simply disappear wherever they choose. The Duke studied her more carefully then, not her dress, not her worn gloves, her exhaustion. The kind carried by people with nowhere left to return. Before he could respond, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. The Duke's mother appeared, pale beneath the chandelier light. They've gone to the front desk, she said quickly. They're asking for the guest registry. Silence crashed over all three of them. Then the older woman looked directly at Clara Belle and whispered the words that changed everything. They know you were sitting with us. Clara Belle felt the blood drain from her face. The Duke's mother grabbed her arm gently, but firmly, guiding her farther down the hallway before anyone from the dining room could follow. They cannot connect you to this family, the older woman said quickly. If they do, they will use you. For what? To pressure him. The Duke remained silent beside them, though the tightness in his expression confirmed it was true. Clara Belle looked between the two of them in disbelief. I sat down for tea less than an hour ago, she whispered. How has my life suddenly become part of railroad politics? The Duke almost smiled at that, though exhaustion swallowed it before it fully appeared. Because Blackthorn Rail is worth millions, he said quietly. And men with enough greed stop seeing people as people, voices echoed faintly from the lobby below. The men at the front desk were growing louder. The older woman straightened immediately. You must come upstairs with us, Clara Belle hesitated. Every instinct warned her to leave while she still could. She owed these strangers nothing, not loyalty, not trust, certainly not involvement in whatever dangerous business surrounded the Blackthorn family. But another thought kept her frozen in place. If those men were already asking questions about her, leaving alone into the snowy streets might be worse. The Duke seemed to read that fear instantly. You will be safer in the private suites, he said. At least until morning. Safe, the word sounded uncertain even coming from him. Still, Clara Belle finally nodded once. The three of them moved quickly toward the grand staircase at the end of the corridor. Below, the hotel lobby buzzed with growing tension. Guests pretended to read newspapers while secretly listening to the argument unfolding near the front desk. One of the businessmen suddenly looked up. His eyes locked directly onto Clara Belle halfway up the stairs. There she is, the Duke reacted immediately. He stepped closer beside her, shielding her from view as they continued upward without breaking pace. His mother kept moving ahead, her silk skirts brushing sharply against the carpeted stairs. Stop them, one of the men demanded below. They are guests of the hotel, sir, the nervous clerk replied. The Duke muttered something under his breath. Clara Belle could not hear. By the time they reached the second floor, her heart was pounding so hard she could barely think straight. The older woman unlocked a set of double doors at the far end of the hallway and ushered them inside. The suite was enormous. A fire crackled in a marble hearth. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows overlooking the snowy street below. Crystal lamps cast warm, golden light across polished wood furniture and shelves filled with leather-bound books. Yet despite the beauty of the room, tension followed them inside like a storm cloud. The Duke crossed immediately to the window. They brought too many men for a simple conversation, he said quietly. His mother removed her gloves with trembling fingers. That means they are desperate. Clara Belle stood near the doorway, still clutching her travel bag. No one has explained what they actually want from you. The Duke remained facing the window for several moments before answering. They want control of the Western Rail expansion, she frowned slightly. The new line toward Kansas City? Now both mother and son looked at her in surprise. My father worked rail yards, she explained softly. People talk about expansions constantly around stations. Something shifted in the Duke's expression then, respect perhaps. He turned back toward her fully. The Western Line determines which towns survive over the next decade, he said. Freight routes, cattle transport, banking access. Whoever controls those tracks controls entire regions. And these men want your company. They want me removed from it. The fire crackled loudly between them. Clara Belle suddenly understood why marriage mattered so much to his mother. Investors trusted appearances. A stable engagement, respectable headlines, a future heir. Those things could steady nervous businessmen long enough to stop rivals from taking power. It was not romance they were fighting for. It was survival. A hard knock suddenly rattled the suite door. All three froze. Another knock followed, louder this time. "Your Grace?" called a voice from outside. "There's a telegram requiring your signature." The Duke's eyes narrowed immediately. "At this hour?" The older woman shook her head once. "No." The knocking came again. Clarabelle noticed the Duke move subtly closer to the fireplace poker resting against the hearth. "Who sent the telegram?" he asked through the door. A brief pause answered him. Then came a different voice. "One of your investors." The Duke looked toward his mother. She whispered only two words. "Don't open." Silence filled the suite. Then the doorknob moved slightly. Once, twice. Clarabelle's breath caught in her throat. Someone outside was testing the lock? The Duke stepped forward slowly, every muscle tense. The warm firelight no longer softened him now. He looked exactly like the kind of man who had spent months fighting enemies from every direction. Another sound echoed from below the hotel, shouting, then the sharp crash of something breaking in the lobby. The older woman closed her eyes briefly as if she already feared the answer. But before anyone could speak again, Clarabelle noticed something else through the tall window beside the curtains. More men were arriving outside, and one of them was carrying tomorrow morning's newspaper already printed with a headline large enough to read from the street. Blackthorn Duke secretly engaged? For several long seconds, nobody in the suite spoke. The Duke stared down at the newspaper in the street below, while snow swirled around the men holding copies in their gloved hands. The bold headline had already done its damage. By sunrise, half the Eastern rail lines would be talking about the mysterious woman engaged to the Duke of Blackthorn. Clarabelle looked toward him slowly. "You released the story yourself," she said. The Duke did not answer immediately. His mother did. "I did." Both of them turned toward the older woman in shock. She lifted her chin with tired dignity. "Those men downstairs planned to destroy him by morning whether we acted or not," she said firmly. "So I moved first? You forged an engagement announcement?" the Duke asked in disbelief. "I protected this family." The knocking outside the suite finally stopped, followed by retreating footsteps down the hallway. Whoever had come to the door clearly realized the battle had changed. The older woman walked toward the fireplace slowly. "For months, investors have questioned your leadership," she told her son. "They see grief and exhaustion and mistake it for weakness. By tomorrow, they will see stability instead." The Duke rubbed one hand across his face. "You involved an innocent woman in a national scandal. I gave them a future headline they could not control." Clarabelle remained near the window, still trying to understand how quickly her world had changed. Only yesterday she had been counting the last coins in her purse beside a crowded rail station. Now strangers across the city believed she was engaged to one of the wealthiest men in America. Oddly enough, she no longer felt afraid, only overwhelmed. The Duke crossed the room toward her. "You deserve the truth," he said quietly. "All of it." She looked up at him. "The men downstairs already owned shares in Blackthorn Rail after my father died. They expected me to sell the western expansion routes cheaply so they could divide the profits among themselves. And you refused." "Yes." His voice hardened slightly. "My father built railroads to connect struggling towns and working families. Those men only see numbers on paper." "They would abandon half the western routes if it earned them faster profits?" Clarabelle thought about all the small railroad towns she had traveled through. Farmers waiting for shipments. Families depending on station work. Entire communities surviving because trains continued stopping there. Now she understood why he fought so fiercely. "You could have explained this earlier," she said softly. A faint smile touched his face. "You looked ready to run the first hour we met." "That is because your mother offered me a fake engagement beside a cup of tea." To her surprise, the Duke laughed quietly for the first time all evening. The sound changed him completely. Some of the coldness disappeared, revealing the man beneath the pressure and endless responsibility. Even his mother seemed relieved hearing it. Outside, the hotel lobby slowly quieted. The rival businessmen had likely realized forcing a confrontation now would only strengthen public sympathy for the Duke and his supposed fiancée. The older woman approached Clarabelle carefully. "My dear," she said gently, "I owe you an apology more than anyone. Clarabelle shook her head lightly. You were trying to save your family, and yet I nearly ruined your peace in the process. For a moment silence settled warmly between them. Then the Duke spoke again. The engagement does not have to continue. His mother looked startled. But he kept his attention on Clarabelle. By morning, I can announce it was exaggerated gossip from the hotel staff. You may leave with enough money to start fresh anywhere you wish. The offer was sincere. That was what made her answer difficult. Clarabelle walked slowly toward the fire, thinking of the lonely road waiting westward. Another town. Another boarding house. Another struggle to survive quietly while the world moved on without noticing her. Then she thought of the man standing before her. A duke carrying grief alone. A railroad empire balanced on his shoulders. A family fighting to protect something larger than wealth. And despite every opportunity to use her, he kept offering her freedom instead. You know, she said softly, this arrangement might look more believable if the couple involved actually spent time together. The Duke blinked once in surprise. His mother nearly smiled. Clarabelle continued before she lost courage. I am not saying yes to forever. I barely know you. Her lips curved slightly. But I am saying perhaps I should stay long enough to see whether the newspapers guessed correctly. For the first time that night, warmth fully reached the Duke's eyes. Real warmth. Not duty, not strategy, hope. Snow continued falling beyond the tall hotel windows as dawn slowly approached the city. Down below, newsboys already hurried through the streets carrying fresh headlines about the Duke of Blackthorn and his mysterious engagement. Months later, people would still argue about where the romance truly began. Some claimed it started with the newspaper announcement. Others believed it began the moment the Duke took her hand in the hotel dining room. But Clarabelle always insisted the truth was much simpler. It began with a cold cup of tea, a tired mother desperate to save her family, and two lonely people who never expected to find a future sitting across from each other on a winter night. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.